I walked into my own house and found a stranger standing in my foyer, calm, polished, and giving orders like she owned the place. Movers brushed past me, carrying my things, my memories, my life. Then she turned, smiled, and said, "Edward asked me to handle this. It's time for you to leave, Teresa." For a moment, I just stared at her. Then, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because she had no idea what she'd just stepped into. I pulled out my phone, dialed my lawyer, and said, "Diane, I think it's time. If you've ever been underestimated or pushed aside, I want to hear your story. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. And if this moment already made your heart race, stay with me. You're going to want to see what happens next." My name is Teresa Cook. I'm 62 years old, and until recently, I was the kind of woman people described with soft, polite words, graceful, supportive, devoted. The kind of woman who hosted holiday dinners that looked effortless, who remembered birthdays without reminders, who stood slightly behind her husband at social events, smiling at the right moments while he told stories that somehow always made him sound like the hero. For 36 years, I was married to Edward Cook. If you had asked anyone in Savannah what they thought of us, they would have said we were solid, stable, respected. Edward was a financial advisor with a long list of clients who trusted him with their life savings. He wore tailored suits, shook hands with confidence, and spoke in calm, measured tones that made people feel safe. I was the wife who made that image complete, the warm home, the perfect dinners, the quiet strength behind his success. But what people don't understand about marriages like mine is that they don't break all at once. They erode, slowly, quietly. So quietly that you don't even realize what's happening until one day you look up and wonder how you became a guest in your own life. In the beginning, Edward and I built everything together. We were young, broke, and determined. I worked 2 jobs while he studied for his certifications. I balanced our checkbook down to the last dollar. I learned how to stretch groceries for a week when we barely had enough for 3 days. When he opened his first small office, I was the one answering phones, filing paperwork, even making coffee for clients because we couldn't afford a receptionist. Those early years were hard, but they were honest. We were a team, somewhere along the way that changed. It didn't happen overnight. It never does. At first, it was subtle. Edward started working later. Then later became much later. Then weekends. Then business trips that felt just a little too frequent. When I asked about them, he would sigh in that way that made me feel like I was inconveniencing him. "You don't understand how demanding this job is, Teresa," he would say, loosening his tie like the weight of success was choking him. "Everything I do is for this family." And I believed him, because that's what women like me were taught to do. We were taught that a good wife supports. She doesn't question too much. She doesn't make things harder. She doesn't create conflict where there doesn't need to be any. Especially not when there are children watching. Michael and Emily were already grown by then, but habits don't disappear just because the house gets quieter. I had spent decades keeping the peace, smoothing over tension, making sure no one felt uncomfortable for too long, including Edward, especially Edward. Over time, his tone changed. The warmth in his voice, the one that used to belong to me, became something he reserved for clients, for acquaintances, for strangers. With me, he became impatient, critical, distant. If dinner wasn't exactly what he wanted, he would barely touch it. If I tried to talk about my day, he would check his phone mid-sentence. If I asked him a direct question, he would either deflect or answer in a way that made me feel foolish for asking in the first place. "You worry too much. You're overthinking again. Why do you always assume the worst?" Little phrases, harmless on their own, but repeated often enough, they begin to reshape how you see yourself. I started to question my instincts, to second-guess my thoughts before I even spoke them out loud. I became quieter not because I had nothing to say, but because I had learned that speaking often led to dismissal. And Edward he grew more confident in that silence. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. We still attended events together, still hosted dinners, still sat side by side at church. But there's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from sitting next to someone who no longer sees you. It's colder than being alone. The first time I truly felt the distance as something permanent was at a charity gala about 8 years ago. Edward was across the room, laughing with a group of people I didn't recognize. His hand rested lightly on the back of a woman's chair as he leaned in to say something that made her smile. It wasn't inappropriate. Not exactly. But it wasn't nothing either. I remember standing there holding a glass of wine I hadn't taken a sip from watching him from across the room, waiting for him to look up, to notice me, to acknowledge that I was there. He didn't, not once. That night when we got home, I mentioned it casually. "You seemed very engaged with that group tonight," I said, trying to keep my tone light. Edward didn't even look at me as he took off his jacket. "It's called networking, Teresa. You wouldn't understand." There it was again. That subtle dismissal, that quiet rewriting of reality where I was always just a step behind him, a little less informed, a little less capable. I let it go. Because I always let it go. Years passed like that, small moments stacking on top of each other, forming something heavy I couldn't quite name at the time. I told myself it was normal, that long marriages changed. That passion faded, and what remained was companionship. But what we had wasn't companionship. It was coexistence. And even that felt like it was slipping. Edward began making more financial decisions without discussing them with me. At first, I didn't think much of it. He handled the money. That was his domain. But then I noticed things that didn't quite add up. Transfers I didn't recognize. Accounts I didn't remember opening. When I asked, he would wave it off. "It's complicated." Trust me. I did. Until trust started to feel less like a choice and more like a risk. The truth is, I didn't wake up one morning and suddenly realize my marriage was in trouble. I woke up one morning and realized I had been ignoring the truth for years. And by then, Edward had already started rewriting the story of our lives in a way that slowly erased me from it. Not loudly, not dramatically, but effectively. He became the man who built everything, and I became the woman who lived in it. So when that woman, Lily Brooks, stood in my foyer and told me to leave Edward's house, I understood something in a way I never had before. This didn't start that afternoon. This was the final step of something that had been unfolding for a long, long time. And for the first time in 36 years, I wasn't going to let it happen quietly. Looking back now, I can pinpoint the exact moment when suspicion stopped being a passing thought and settled into something heavier, something I could no longer ignore. It wasn't a dramatic discovery. No lipstick on a collar, no late-night confession. Just a small, ordinary moment that felt wrong. Edward's phone rang while he was in the shower. That, in itself, wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way the phone kept ringing, persistent, almost urgent. I glanced at it from across the bedroom, not intending to pick it up, just curious. The screen lit up again. Lily. No last name, no context, just Lily. I remember standing there staring at that name as if it might rearrange itself into something harmless if I looked long enough. It didn't. When Edward came out of the bathroom towel around his neck, I asked him casually, "Who's Lily?" He didn't miss a beat. "A client," he said, reaching for his phone. "Why? Just curious," I replied. He nodded, already scrolling, already done with the conversation. That should have been enough. A simple answer. A reasonable explanation. But something about the way he said it, too smooth, too immediate, didn't sit right with me. So I did what I had trained myself to do for years. I pushed the feeling down. Except this time, it didn't stay down. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing things I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. Edward became more protective of his phone. It was always face down, always within reach. If a message came in, he would glance at it quickly, then lock the screen before I could even shift my eyes in his direction. He started going to the gym. Now that might sound like a positive change, but Edward had never been a gym person. For decades, he had complained about not having time, about back pain, about how people who obsessed over fitness had nothing better to do. And suddenly, at 65, he was going 5 times a week. New clothes followed, fitted shirts, shoes I had never seen before, a cologne that wasn't the one I had bought him for years. I remember standing in our bathroom one morning, holding that unfamiliar bottle in my hand, wondering when exactly my husband had become someone I didn't recognize. Still, I said nothing, because saying something would mean acknowledging what it might be. And I wasn't ready for that. The business trips came next. At first they were occasional, then more frequent. Then oddly timed, leaving on a Thursday afternoon, returning late Sunday night, claiming it was for client meetings that couldn't be rescheduled. Once I asked which client required weekend availability. Edward sighed long and exaggerated. "This is what I mean, Teresa," he said. "You don't understand how this works anymore. The market doesn't run on your schedule. That word anymore stung more than I expected, as if I had fallen behind. As if I was no longer relevant to the world he lived in. I started to question myself. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I was being insecure. Maybe this was just what aging felt like, watching your partner evolve while you stayed the same. So I did something I had done many times before. I turned to my children. Emily came over one afternoon, sitting across from me at the kitchen table with a cup of tea she barely touched. "I think your father might be seeing someone," I said carefully. She blinked, then shook her head almost immediately. "Mom, no," she said. "Dad wouldn't do that." "I'm not saying I'm sure," I replied. Something feels off." Emily reached across the table, placing her hand over mine. "You've been stressed lately," she said gently. "Maybe you're reading too much into things. Dad's just busy. You know how he is." That familiar phrase again. You know how he is. As if that explained everything. As if that made everything acceptable. A few days later, I spoke to Michael. He didn't even let me finish. "Mom, seriously," he said, leaning back in his chair with a frustrated laugh. "Dad's been working his whole life to take care of us. And now you're accusing him of cheating." "I'm not accusing," I said quietly. "I'm asking." "Well, it sounds like accusing," he replied. "And it's not fair, not fair." That was the word he chose. Not concerning, not worth looking into, just unfair. I remember sitting there looking at my son, the boy I had raised, comforted, protected, and realizing that in his eyes I had somehow become the problem. Not Edward. Me. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. I stopped expecting anyone else to validate what I was feeling. If I wanted the truth, I was going to have to find it myself. So I began to pay attention. Not in an obvious way. I didn't confront Edward. I didn't accuse him. I didn't search his phone or follow him around town. Instead, I watched. I listened. I remembered. I started keeping a small notebook in my nightstand. At first, it felt almost ridiculous, like something out of a detective novel. But the more I wrote, the clearer things became. Dates of his trips, times he left and returned, names he mentioned in passing, changes in his behavior. I wasn't trying to catch him in a lie. I was trying to understand the pattern, and there was a pattern. Always the same days. The same vague explanations. The same defensive tone whenever I asked even the simplest question. Then one evening, everything sharpened. Edward had left his laptop open in the study. That alone wasn't unusual, but what caught my attention was the screen. An email. I didn't mean to read it. Truly, I didn't. But the subject line was enough to pull me in. "I missed last weekend already." My chest tightened as I stepped closer. The sender, Lily Brooks. There it was. Not just Lily anymore. A full name. A real person. I read the first line before I could stop myself. "Next time we should stay longer." It felt too short being in that house without her noticing. I didn't read any further. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, everything clicked into place. The phone calls, the trips, the distance, the quiet contempt. It wasn't in my head. It was real. And worse than that, it had been happening right under my nose. In my home, in my life. I closed the laptop slowly, my hands steady in a way that surprised me. No tears. No shouting. No confrontation. Just clarity. Edward wasn't slipping away from me. He had already left. And the woman standing in my foyer that afternoon, the one who told me to leave, wasn't the beginning of the story. She was just the moment the truth finally stepped out into the open. But what neither Edward nor Lily understood was this: I wasn't the woman they thought I was anymore. And I had no intention of reacting the way they expected. The night I closed Edward's laptop, I didn't sleep. Not because I was crying, there were no tears left for that, but because something inside me had finally settled into place. A quiet, steady awareness that felt unfamiliar after years of confusion. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't doubting myself. I was certain Edward was having an affair. Not a fleeting mistake. Not a moment of weakness. Something sustained. Something calculated. Something that had been happening long enough for him to grow comfortable inside it. And if there's one thing I've learned in 62 years, it's this. People only grow comfortable in lies when they believe those lies won't cost them anything. That thought stayed with me. Because if Edward believed this wouldn't cost him, Then he must have already decided what he was willing to risk and what he thought he could take. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even me. I didn't confront him. Instead, I made coffee, sat across from him at the breakfast table, and asked about his day as if nothing had changed. He answered without looking up from his phone. "I've got meetings most of the afternoon," he said. "Might be late." "Of course you will," I thought. Out loud, I smiled. "That's fine." That was the moment I stopped reacting and started preparing. The first person I reached out to was Grace Holloway. Grace and I had known each other for over 20 years. Our children had grown up together. We had attended the same church, the same community events, the same quiet gatherings where women shared pieces of their lives in between polite conversation. But what most people didn't know was that Grace had spent nearly 3 decades working as a paralegal before she retired. If anyone could help me understand what I was dealing with, it was her. We met for lunch 2 days later at a small cafe tucked away from the busier parts of Savannah. Grace took one look at my face and didn't bother with small talk. "What happened?" she asked. I told her everything. The phone calls, the trips, the email, the name Lily Brooks. Grace didn't interrupt. She just listened, her expression growing more focused with each detail. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and folded her hands. "Okay," she said calmly. "First thing, you did the right thing by not confronting him." I let out a small breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "It doesn't feel like it," I admitted. "That's because you're used to reacting emotionally," she said gently, "and there's nothing wrong with that. But in situations like this, emotion is exactly what people like Edward rely on." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He's already steps ahead," she replied. "You don't cheat for this long without thinking about consequences. He's planning something, Teresa. I'd bet on it." That word again, planning. It sent a quiet chill through me. Grace reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I want you to start documenting everything," she said. "Dates, times, anything unusual. Don't assume something is unimportant. Patterns matter." I hesitated. "I've already started doing that," I admitted. Grace smiled faintly. "Good. Then you're further ahead than you think." She paused, studying me carefully. "There's someone I want you to talk to," she added. "Her name is Diane Whitaker. She's one of the best family lawyers in the state. Smart, careful, and she doesn't scare easily." "I'm not looking for a divorce," I said quickly. Grace didn't react to that. "You're looking for information," she replied, "and right now that's the most important thing you can have." I didn't call Diane immediately. It took me 3 days. 3 days of watching Edward move through the house like nothing had changed. 3 days of hearing his phone buzz at odd hours. 3 days of pretending I wasn't aware that my life was quietly being rewritten without my consent. On the 4th day, I made the call. Diane Whitaker's office was exactly what I expected. Clean, understated, professional, no unnecessary decorations, no attempts to make things feel softer than they were. She greeted me with a firm handshake and a direct gaze. "Mrs. Cook," she said, "Grace speaks highly of you." "I hope that's a good thing," I replied. "It usually is," Diane said, gesturing for me to sit. I told her everything just as I had told Grace. But where Grace had listened with empathy, Diane listened with precision. She asked questions I hadn't thought to ask. "Who is listed on your property deed? Do you have access to all financial accounts? Has your husband made any recent changes to insurance trusts or beneficiary designations?" Each question felt like it peeled back another layer of something I had never fully examined. "I'm not sure I admitted more than once." Diane nodded, as if that was the answer she expected. "That's okay," she said. "Most people in long marriages aren't." She leaned forward slightly. "Let me be very clear about something, Teresa. Affairs are rarely just about emotions, especially not when there are assets involved." My stomach tightened. "You think this is about money? I think it could be," she replied. "Or control. Or both." She opened a folder on her desk and slid a notepad toward me. "From this point forward, I want you to assume that every decision he's making has a purpose," she said. "Your job is not to react to those decisions. Your job is to understand them." That sentence stayed with me. Understand, not react. Over the next several weeks, I followed Diane's guidance carefully. I gathered documents, bank statements, property records, old tax filings, things I hadn't looked at closely in years because I had trusted Edward to manage them. That trust, I was beginning to realize, had come at a cost. The more I looked, the more questions I found. There were transfers I didn't recognize, accounts linked to names I didn't know. A small company, nothing flashy, nothing obvious that appeared in several transactions. Shell company, Diane said when I showed her. For what I asked. That's what we're going to find out. Then came the part that unsettled me the most. Have you noticed any attempts to undermine your decision-making? Diane asked one afternoon. I frowned. What do you mean? Comments about your memory, your judgment, your emotional stability. I thought about it. Edward's words over the years. You worry too much. You're overthinking. You're not seeing things clearly. I thought that was just... I hesitated. Marriage. Diane's expression didn't change. It might be, she said. Or it might be something else. What kind of something else? She held my gaze. Preparation. That word hit harder than anything else she had said. Preparation for what Diane didn't answer that question directly. Not yet. Instead, she gave me one final piece of advice before I left her office that day. Do not confront him, she said firmly. Not until we understand exactly what he's doing. If he thinks you're unaware, he'll continue. And when people continue, they make mistakes. I nodded slowly. And if I'm right, I asked quietly. If you're right, Diane said, then we make sure he regrets underestimating you. By the time I walked out of her office, something had shifted inside me. I wasn't the woman sitting at the kitchen table wondering if she was imagining things anymore. I was a woman gathering evidence, a woman paying attention, a woman preparing. So when Lily Brooks stood in my foyer weeks later telling me to leave my own home, she thought she was stepping into the final act. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had been preparing for that moment long before she ever walked through my front door. There's something people don't talk about enough when it comes to marriage, especially long marriages. Ownership, not just of property, but of narrative, of identity, of who gets credit for what and who quietly disappears behind the scenes. For years, Edward spoke about our home in a way that slowly shifted over time. At first, it was the house we built. Then it became the house I worked so hard to provide. And eventually, without me even realizing when it happened, it turned into my house. It's strange how language can change reality if no one challenges it. But the truth is, that house in Savannah, the one with the wide porch, the magnolia tree out front, and the kitchen where I raised my children, that house was never Edward's. Not legally, not originally, and not in any way that actually mattered. The house belonged to my family long before Edward ever stepped foot inside it. It was my mother's. She had inherited it from her parents, and when she passed away, it came to me. Not as a gift, not as a shared marital asset, but as a direct inheritance, protected, documented, and very clearly outlined. I remember sitting in a quiet office years ago, signing papers I didn't fully understand at the time, trusting that it was just another step in handling my mother's estate. But those papers mattered. More than I could have imagined. Because after Edward made a series of questionable financial decisions early in his career, risks that didn't pay off the way he expected, my mother insisted on one thing before she finalized everything. The house would be placed into a trust. At the time, Edward had laughed it off. Your mother doesn't trust me, he said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She's just being careful, I replied. She's being dramatic, he corrected. Maybe she was. Or maybe she saw something I didn't. Because that trust, something I barely thought about for years, became the single most important detail in everything that was happening now. When I sat across from Diane and showed her the documents, she didn't even hesitate. This is solid, she said, tapping the page lightly. Very solid. Meaning, I asked. Meaning this house is not his, she replied. Not jointly owned, not partially owned. Not something he can transfer, sell, or assign to anyone else. I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. But we've been married for decades, I said. Doesn't that change anything? Diane shook her head. Not in this case. Inherited property, especially when it's placed into a properly structured trust, is a completely different category. He can live there. He can benefit from it. But he doesn't own it. That word landed heavily. Own. Edward had built his entire identity around ownership, his business, his success, his family, even me. And now the one thing he seemed most confident about, the house he stood in, the house he presented as his, was the one thing he had absolutely no legal claim to. Then why would he act like it's his? I asked. Diane looked at me carefully. Because no one ever corrected him, she said. I sat back in my chair, letting that sink in. She wasn't wrong. I hadn't corrected him. Not when he casually referred to it as my place in front of clients. Not when he made decisions about renovations without consulting me. Not when he spoke over me in conversations about the house as if my connection to it was sentimental, not real. I had allowed it. Not intentionally. Not consciously. But consistently. And over time, that silence had turned into permission. Permission for him to believe the narrative he was creating. A narrative where he was the provider, the owner, the man who built everything, and I was simply the woman who lived in it. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Because if Edward believed the house was his or convinced himself that it was, then Lily believing it too made perfect sense. She wasn't the one rewriting reality. She was just stepping into the version of it Edward had been presenting. Still, one question kept circling in my mind. If he doesn't own the house, I said slowly, why would he be bold enough to send her to remove me from it? Diane didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another file and opened it. That's the part that concerns me, she said. My stomach tightened. Why? Because people don't make moves like that unless they think they're protected, she replied. Protected how? She slid a document across the desk toward me. I looked down at it, scanning the text, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. At first it didn't register. Then it did, and the realization sent a cold wave through my chest. This, I said slowly, this is about my competency, Diane nodded. He's laying groundwork, she said, quietly, strategically. I felt my hands grow colder. For what? To challenge your ability to manage your own affairs, she replied. The room seemed to narrow around me. You're saying he's trying to prove I'm not capable of owning my own home, or managing it, Diane said, or making decisions about it. I stared at the paper again, my mind racing. Small things, things I had dismissed, things I had barely noticed, suddenly rearranged themselves into something far more deliberate. Edward asking if I had taken my medication. Edward commenting on my memory. Edward correcting me in front of others in ways that made me seem forgetful, uncertain. At the time, I thought it was annoyance or habit, but now it looked like something else, something planned. He's been building a case, I whispered. Diane didn't soften her response. Yes, she said. He has. I leaned back slowly, trying to steady my breathing. And if he succeeds, I asked. If he succeeds, Diane said carefully, he could argue that you're not fit to manage the trust. And if that happens, control could be transferred. To him, possibly. Or to someone he influences. The implication was clear. This wasn't just about an affair. It wasn't just about replacing me. It was about removing me, legally, completely, and taking what had never belonged to him in the first place. For a moment, I felt something close to panic. Not fear of losing the house, but fear of how far Edward had been willing to go without me realizing it. But then Diane said something that shifted everything. Teresa, she said, her voice steady, look at me. I did. You came to me before he made his move, she continued. That matters. How, I asked. Because we've already taken steps, she said. My brow furrowed slightly. What steps? She reached into the file again and pulled out another document. This is your independent evaluation, she said, sliding it toward me. I looked down at it, recognition slowly forming. The appointment I had almost canceled. The tests I didn't fully understand at the time. You told me it was just precaution, I said. It is, Diane replied, and it's also protection. I scanned the page. Clear. Professional. Undeniable. A full assessment confirming that I was mentally sound, fully capable, and in complete control of my decision-making. Edward's narrative. Neutralized. Before he even realized it would be challenged. A slow breath left my body. So he thinks he's ahead, I said quietly. Diane's lips curved slightly. Yes, she said. He does. And he's not. No, she replied. He's not. For the first time since I had read that email, I felt something different. Not just clarity. Not just determination. But power. Quiet. Controlled. Earned power. Because Edward wasn't just underestimating me emotionally. He was underestimating me legally. Strategically. Completely. So when Lily stood in my foyer and told me to leave Edward's house, she wasn't just wrong. She was standing in the middle of a lie that was about to collapse. And Edward had no idea how much of his plan had already fallen apart. Once you understand that someone has been quietly building a case against you, it changes the way you remember everything, every conversation, every look. Every small moment that once felt insignificant suddenly carries weight. And in my case, those moments began to rearrange themselves into something far more deliberate than I had ever allowed myself to see. Edward hadn't just been dismissing me, he had been documenting me. The realization didn't come all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as Diane and I went back through the past year with a different lens. "Tell me about the last time he questioned your memory," Diane said during one of our meetings. I sat across from her trying to recall something that had felt so ordinary at the time. "There was a dinner," I said slowly. "About 6 months ago. We were hosting some of his clients. I forgot to bring out the dessert right away." Diane nodded, encouraging me to continue. "He made a comment," I said. "Something like, 'You've been forgetful lately, Teresa. Maybe you should write things down more.'" Everyone laughed. I laughed too. But now sitting there in Diane's office, it didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt like positioning. "Was that the first time?" Diane asked. "No," I admitted. "Just the first time I remember clearly. There were others. Small corrections in public, gentle, almost concerned tones when he spoke about me to others. She's been a little overwhelmed lately. I think she's just tired. She forgets things sometimes, but who doesn't at our age? Always subtle, always reasonable. Always framed in a way that made him sound caring rather than critical. At the time, I had been grateful he wasn't harsher. Now I saw the strategy. He wasn't trying to tear me down. He was trying to reshape how others saw me, and more dangerously, how I saw myself. Because the most effective manipulation doesn't just convince others, it convinces you. "There was a doctor," I said, suddenly, the memory surfacing with a clarity that made my chest tighten. Diane's eyes sharpened. "Tell me about that." "It was after my minor surgery last year," I explained. "Nothing serious, just a procedure that required some pain medication for a few days, and I missed a lunch with Emily," I said. "I completely forgot about it. I was groggy, disoriented." Edward made a big deal out of it. "How so?" He called the doctor, I said, asked if that level of forgetfulness was normal. Then he kept bringing it up afterward. Not aggressively, just repeatedly. I could hear his voice in my head as I spoke. "You didn't remember at all, Teresa. That's not like you. It's concerning. At the time, I had felt embarrassed, ashamed even. I had apologized to Emily, brushed it off, and promised to be more careful. But now it looked like something else." "He used that," I said quietly. Diane didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, "he likely did." The idea settled heavily between us. Edward had taken a moment when I was vulnerable, medicated, recovering not fully myself, and turned it into a narrative, a starting point, a piece of evidence. "What about written records?" Diane asked. "Emails, notes, anything like that?" I frowned slightly. "I don't know," I said. "I never had access to his work communications." "That's fine," she replied. "We'll find out another way." But I already knew the answer. Because once I started looking, I began to notice things I had overlooked before. Not just in his behavior, but in his environment. His office. His desk. There had always been a notebook he kept, something he referred to as his client log. I had never paid much attention to it. It seemed harmless. Professional. Now I wondered what else it contained. "Teresa," Diane said, gently pulling me back to the present. "I need you to understand something." I looked up at her. "This kind of strategy isn't impulsive," she continued. "It takes time, consistency, planning." I nodded slowly. "I see that now." "And if he's been doing this for months," she added, "then he's likely already spoken to someone, a doctor, maybe even an attorney." A quiet chill moved through me. "You think he's already started the process? I think he's been preparing for it," she said carefully. "Yes." I let out a slow breath, trying to steady myself. It was one thing to know your husband was cheating. It was another to realize he had been quietly building a case to remove you from your own life, from your home, from your authority, from yourself. "Why?" I asked, the word barely above a whisper. Diane held my gaze. "Because control is easier to take than to negotiate," she said. That answer stayed with me long after I left her office. Control. Edward had always liked control. Over finances. Over decisions. Over how things were presented to the world. And when I started to pull away, when I stopped reacting the way he expected, he didn't try to fix the marriage. He tried to eliminate the variable he couldn't control anymore, me. But what Edward didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that I had already taken steps he never anticipated. The evaluation. I remember sitting in that quiet clinic answering questions that felt almost absurd at the time. Can you recall 3 words after a short delay? Can you describe the steps involved in preparing a simple meal? What would you do if you found a stamped, addressed envelope on the ground? I had almost laughed at some of them. It felt unnecessary. Excessive. Trust me, Diane had said when she suggested it. It's better to have it and not need it than the other way around. Now, holding that report in my hands, I understood exactly what she meant. Because everything Edward had been building, every comment, every implication, every carefully planted doubt relied on one thing: the absence of proof. And we had just removed that, completely. You're clear, Diane had said when we reviewed the results together. Unquestionably so. So if he tries to argue that I'm not capable, I began. He loses, she finished. It was that simple. For the first time since this all began, I felt something shift inside me again. Not fear, not even anger, but certainty. Edward's plan wasn't just cruel, it was flawed. Because he had assumed I would remain passive, that I would continue to doubt myself, that I wouldn't think to protect myself until it was too late. He had underestimated me, and that was his first real mistake. The second, sending Lily to my house, because in doing so, he didn't just expose the affair. He forced everything into the open before his plan was fully secured, before his narrative was uncontested, before he was ready. And that gave me something I hadn't had before: leverage. So when I stood in that foyer phone in my hand, Diane's voice steady on the other end of the line, I wasn't just reacting to a betrayal. I was stepping into a moment I had already prepared for. And Edward? He was about to learn that the woman he thought he could quietly erase had already rewritten the ending. Diane didn't raise her voice when I put her on speaker. She didn't need to. "Good afternoon," she said calmly, her tone even controlled. "This is Diane Whitaker, attorney for Mrs. Teresa Cook." "Who am I speaking with?" Lily hesitated for just a fraction of a second. I saw it, the first crack in her composure. "This is Lily Brooks," she replied, lifting her chin slightly as if trying to recover authority. "I'm here on behalf of Edward Cook." Diane paused just long enough to let that statement settle into the air. "I see," she said. "And what exactly are you doing in Mrs. Cook's residence, miss?" Brooks Lily's eyes flickered toward me, then back toward the phone. "I'm facilitating a transition," she said. "Edward has asked me to oversee the process of Stop Diane," interrupted, still calm but now unmistakably firm. "Before you say another word, I need you to understand the legal implications of what you are currently doing." The movers, who had been shifting boxes upstairs, began to slow. One of them stepped into the hallway, glancing between Lily and me, sensing the shift in tone. Lily crossed her arms, defensive now. "I don't think that's necessary," she said. "Edward owns this house." "No," Diane replied, her voice cutting cleanly through the room. "He does not. Silence. Not the soft kind. The heavy kind that forces everyone to pay attention." I watched Lily's expression carefully. The confidence didn't disappear all at once. It wavered, just slightly. "You're mistaken," she said. "Edward has made it very clear. Edward has made many things very clear," Diane said. "Unfortunately for you, accuracy is not one of them." A sharp breath left Lily's lips. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "I'm not discussing property law with you. I'm here to make sure Mrs. Cook vacates the premises peacefully." At that, I almost smiled. Not because it was amusing, but because I could see it now. She still believed she was in control. Diane didn't react to Lily's tone. Instead, she shifted slightly, and when she spoke again, there was a precision in her words that felt almost surgical. "Miss Brooks," she said, "you are currently participating in what could be classified as an unlawful attempted dispossession of property belonging to my client. Additionally, if any items are removed from this residence without Mrs. Cook's explicit consent, you and any individuals acting under your direction may be liable for civil and potentially criminal charges, including trespass and conversion." The words landed exactly the way they were meant to. One of the movers quietly set a box down. Another stepped back entirely. Lily's posture stiffened. I was told this was being handled, she said, her voice no longer as steady as before. You were told incorrectly, Diane replied. I could feel the shift in the room now, subtle but undeniable. The power was no longer where Lily thought it was. Then perhaps you should speak to Edward directly, Lily said, grasping for ground. He'll confirm everything. I'm sure he would, Diane said. However, Mr. Cook's statements do not override documented legal ownership. And at this moment, he is not the one standing in that house. You are. A beat. And that places responsibility on you. Lily's eyes flicked toward the staircase, then back to me. For the first time since I walked through that door, she looked uncertain. What do you want me to do? She asked, her voice lower now. Diane didn't hesitate. I want all activity to stop immediately, she said. No further items are to be moved. No property is to be touched. And I strongly advise that you and anyone else present remain where you are until this situation is clarified. And if we don't, Lily asked, though there was far less challenge in her tone now. Then I will be contacting local authorities, Diane replied evenly. And I assure you, Miss Brooks, that will not work in your favor. The silence that followed was complete. Even the air felt still. Then, the front door opened. Edward stepped inside. He looked exactly the way he always did when he entered a room he expected to control. Shoulders back, expression composed, presence deliberate. But that expression shifted the moment he saw me. Not dramatically, just enough. Teresa, he said, as if this were a minor inconvenience. What's going on? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I watched him. Really watched him. This man I had spent 36 years with. This man who thought he could quietly replace me, remove me, rewrite me. And for the first time, I didn't feel small in his presence. I felt separate. You tell me, I said calmly. Edward's gaze flicked briefly to Lily, then to the movers, then back to me. I asked Lily to handle this, he said. There's no need to make a scene. A scene. That's what he thought this was. Diane's voice cut in from the phone. Mr. Cook, she said, this is Diane Whitaker. Edward froze. Not visibly, but I knew him well enough to see it. Ah, he said after a brief pause. Of course, I should have expected that. Yes, Diane replied. You should have. His jaw tightened slightly. This doesn't need to escalate, he said. Teresa and I can handle this privately. I agree, Diane said. Which is why I recommend you immediately cease all attempts to remove Mrs. Cook from a property you do not legally own. There it was, out in the open. No softness, no ambiguity. Edward's eyes shifted to me sharper now. What is she talking about? He asked. I met his gaze without flinching. The truth, I said. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Edward let out a short, controlled laugh. This is unnecessary, he said. You're overcomplicating things, Teresa. That word again. Overcomplicating. As if clarity were a problem. As if truth were inconvenient. Diane didn't give him time to regain control. Mr. Cook, she said, I have reviewed all relevant documentation regarding the property in question. Your name does not appear on the deed. The residence is held in a protected trust under Mrs. Cook's ownership. Any attempt to assert control over that property without her consent is legally indefensible. Edward's expression hardened. That's not how marriage works, he said. No, Diane replied. That's not how marriage works. That's how ownership works. The distinction hung in the air. Sharp, final. Lily took a step back. Just one. But it was enough, because it wasn't just a physical movement. It was recognition. Recognition that something she had believed, something Edward had told her, wasn't holding up under pressure. You told me, she began, looking at Edward. He didn't answer her. Instead, he focused on me. You've gone too far, he said quietly. I almost laughed again. Too far. As if I had crossed a line. As if I were the one who had brought another person into our home and tried to erase my partner from it. I haven't gone anywhere, I said. I'm exactly where I've always been. That landed harder than anything else I had said, because it was true. Edward opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time since I had known him, he didn't have an immediate response. Diane spoke once more. Mr. Cook, I suggest you instruct everyone present to leave the property immediately, she said. We can discuss next steps through proper legal channels. Edward didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, calculating. But the moment had already shifted. The control he thought he had, it was gone. And Lily finally understood that she hadn't walked into a home she was about to take over. She had walked into a situation she didn't understand, one that was no longer hers to control. For a few seconds after Diane's last words, no one moved. Not Edward, not Lily, not the movers still hovering awkwardly near the staircase holding boxes that suddenly felt heavier than they had a moment ago. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just sit in a room, it presses down on it. Edward was the first to break. "Everyone put everything down," he said sharply, not looking at me. "We're not doing this like this." The authority in his voice was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't confident anymore. It was reactive. The movers didn't argue. One by one, they set the boxes back where they had taken them from, glancing at each other as if silently agreeing that whatever this was, it was above their pay grade. Lily, however, didn't move right away. She was still looking at Edward. "You said this was your house," she said, her voice tight, controlled, but no longer soft. Edward didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward her slowly, lowering his voice, just enough to sound calm but not enough to hide the tension underneath. "I said I handle everything here," he replied. "That's not the same thing," Lily shot back. I watched them standing just a few feet apart in my foyer, unraveling in front of each other. And for the first time, I realized something important. This wasn't just my moment, it was hers too. Because whatever Edward had told Lily, whatever version of reality he had sold her, it was beginning to fall apart in real time. "Lily," he said, his tone shifting into something smoother, more controlled. "This is just a technical issue. Lawyers complicate things. You know how they are." "No," she said, shaking her head. "I don't know how they are, but I know what you told me." Her voice rose slightly, no longer concerned about keeping things quiet. "You said this house would be ours. That once everything was settled, we would move in together. You said she gestured toward me without looking, wouldn't fight it." Edward's jaw tightened. "Lower your voice," he muttered. "Why?" Lily snapped. "So she doesn't hear, she's standing right here." I almost admired her in that moment. Not because she was right, but because she was finally asking the questions she should have asked from the beginning. Diane's voice came through the phone again, calm as ever. "Mr. Cook," she said, "I strongly advise you to de-escalate this situation immediately." Edward exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. "We can resolve this privately." "You had the opportunity to do that," Diane replied. "You chose not to." That was the thing about truth. Once it's spoken clearly, it's very difficult to push it back into silence. Before Edward could respond, the front door opened again. This time, it was Michael. He stepped inside quickly, his expression already tense, like he had been expecting conflict, but not this. "What's going on?" he asked, looking from Edward to Lily to me. "Your mother is making a scene," Edward said immediately. I didn't react, not because it didn't hurt, but because I had expected it. Michael frowned, turning toward me. "Mom, I met his eyes." "This is my house," I said simply. He blinked. "I know that," he said. "What does that have to do with no?" I interrupted gently. "You don't know that." The confusion on his face deepened. "Of course I do," he said. "Dad bought, he didn't," Diane's voice cut in. Michael's head snapped toward the phone. "Who's that?" he asked. "Diane Whitaker," I said. "My lawyer." That word lawyer shifted something in him immediately. "Why do you need a lawyer?" he asked, his tone sharpening. Edward stepped in before I could answer. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Your mother is overreacting." Diane didn't allow that narrative to settle. "Mr. Cook," she said, "if you continue to misrepresent the facts, I will have no choice but to proceed formally." Michael looked between us clearly, trying to piece things together. "Someone explain what's happening," he said. I took a slow breath. "This house belongs to me," I said. "Legally. Completely. Your father has no ownership over it." Michael stared at me. Then at Edward. Then back at me. "That's not," he started. "It is," Diane said. There was a pause. A long one. "You're saying Dad doesn't own this house?" Michael asked. "Yes," Diane replied. "That is exactly what I'm saying." Michael's brow furrowed. "That doesn't make sense," he said. He's always acted like he did," I said softly. "That's not the same thing." The room shifted again. Not dramatically, but enough. Because now it wasn't just Lily questioning Edward. It was his son. "Dad," Michael said, his voice lower now. Edward didn't answer right away. He looked at me instead, as if this were my fault, as if I had created this moment. Is this true? Michael pressed. Edward exhaled slowly. It's more complicated than that, he said. That's not an answer, Michael replied. It's the only one you're getting right now, Edward snapped. And there it was, the crack, small, but undeniable. Michael took a step back, clearly unsettled. What else is complicated? He asked. Edward didn't respond, because at that exact moment the front door opened again. Emily. She stepped inside more cautiously than Michael had, her eyes scanning the room immediately, sensing the tension. I got your message, she said, looking at Edward. What's going? She stopped mid-sentence, because she saw Lily, and then she saw me, and then she saw the boxes. What is this? She asked. No one answered. For a moment, the entire situation seemed to hang in place, too full, too layered, too exposed to be explained in a single sentence. Then Diane spoke again. Miss Cook, she said, this is Diane Whitaker. I'm representing your mother. Emily blinked, startled. Why does Mom need a lawyer? She asked. I looked at her, really looked at her, my daughter, the one who had told me I was overthinking, the one who had asked me to trust the man who was now standing in front of us, unable to give a straight answer. Because your father tried to remove me from my own home, I said. The words landed heavily. Emily's face paled slightly. What? She whispered. Edward stepped forward. That's not, he began. It is I said. For the first time, I didn't soften it, didn't adjust my tone, didn't try to protect anyone from the truth. Emily looked at him, then at Lily, then at me. What's going on? She asked again, but this time her voice was different. Not dismissive, not reassuring. Afraid. Diane spoke, her voice steady, controlled. Your father attempted to assert control over a property he does not legally own, she said. And he did so without your mother's consent. Emily shook her head slowly. No, she said, that doesn't sound like Dad. I almost smiled. Because that was the problem. It didn't sound like him, but it was him. Then maybe you don't know him as well as you think, I said quietly. The room fell silent again. But this time it was different. Because now the illusion wasn't just cracking. It was breaking. And Edward was running out of space to hide behind it. No one spoke for several seconds after Emily's question hung in the air. What's going on? It was such a simple sentence. But in that moment, it carried 36 years of assumptions, trust, and carefully maintained illusions. Edward was the first to try to answer. This has gotten out of hand, he said, his voice low, controlled again, like he was trying to pull everything back into a version of reality he understood. Your mother is confused. She misunderstood. Stop. The word left my mouth before I could soften it. Not loud, but final. Edward turned to me, his eyes narrowing slightly. Teresa, no, I said, holding his gaze. You don't get to explain me anymore. That shifted something. Not just in him, in the room. Because for years I had allowed him to do exactly that, translate me, reinterpret me, reduce me into something easier for others to accept. And now I wasn't. Emily looked between us, her expression tightening. Mom, what do you mean? She asked carefully. I took a slow breath, grounding myself. This isn't confusion, I said, and it's not a misunderstanding. I gestured lightly toward the room. This is exactly what it looks like. Michael ran a hand over his face, pacing once before stopping near the staircase. Okay then, explain it, he said, because right now none of this makes sense. Diane's voice came through the phone again, steady as ever. I can help clarify, she said. Michael glanced toward the phone, clearly still adjusting to her presence. Please do, he muttered. Diane didn't rush. Your father has no legal ownership of this residence, she said. It is held in a trust under your mother's name. Any attempt to remove her from the property without consent is unlawful. Michael frowned deeply. That's not possible, he said. Dad's been paying for everything here for years. Paying for maintenance does not equal ownership, Diane replied. Emily stepped forward slightly. But he always said, yes, I said quietly. He always said, that was the problem. Not what was true, but what had been said often enough to become accepted. Michael looked at Edward again. Dad, he said more firmly now. Is this true? Edward exhaled slowly, clearly calculating his next move. It's not as simple as they're making it sound, he said. Then make it simple, Michael snapped. Edward's jaw tightened. This house has been our family home for decades, he said. I've taken care of it, paid for it, maintained it. That's not the question, Michael interrupted. Do you own it? Silence. A long one. Edward didn't answer. And that was answer enough. Emily's hand slowly rose to her mouth. Oh my God, she whispered. Lily took another step back. Just one more. But now it was unmistakable. Distance. Not just physical. Emotional. I asked you, she said quietly, her voice no longer sharp but shaken. I asked you if everything was clear, if there would be any problems. Edward didn't look at her. Not now, Lily, he muttered. No, she said, shaking her head. No, you don't get to say that. Not now. Her composure, the one she walked in with, was gone. In its place was something much more real, something much less controlled. You told me she wouldn't fight, Lily continued, her voice rising again. You told me she didn't have any control over anything anymore. Emily's head snapped toward me. What does that mean? She asked. I didn't answer immediately, because this was the part I had been dreading. Not the affair, not the house, but this. The moment my children would have to face what their father had been building behind the scenes, Diane didn't hesitate. It means, she said carefully, that your father has been attempting to establish a narrative regarding your mother's mental competency. The words landed like a crack through glass. Emily stared at the phone. What she whispered. Michael froze completely. That's not, he began, but stopped, turning slowly toward Edward. Dad. Edward's expression hardened. This is being twisted, he said. I was concerned. That's all. Concerned about her well-being. By telling people she was unstable, I asked quietly. His eyes flicked to mine. I never said that, he replied. You didn't have to, I said, because that was the truth. He never used those exact words. He didn't need to. The implication had always been enough. Emily shook her head, slowly stepping back. No, I don't understand, she said. Mom, you've been fine. You've always been fine. I looked at her, softly. I know, I said. Her eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in a long time. Uncertainty. Michael turned fully toward Edward now, his expression no longer defensive but searching. What did you do? He asked. Edward didn't answer. Not directly. I was protecting this family, he said instead. That word again, protecting, as if everything he had done, every lie, every manipulation had been for our benefit, from what Michael demanded. Edward hesitated, just for a second, but it was enough, because in that hesitation something else surfaced. Not justification, not control, fear, and Michael saw it. We all did. What did you do? He repeated, his voice lower now. Edward looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Not authority, not certainty, but calculation breaking down. I made decisions, he said slowly, to secure our future. Lily let out a short, hollow laugh. Our future, she said. You mean your escape plan? That landed hard, because that was exactly what it was. An escape from responsibility, from consequences, from the life he had built and the woman he had built it with. You promised me something real, Lily continued. Not this. Edward didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. Michael stepped back, shaking his head. I don't even know who you are right now, he said. Emily looked like she might cry. And me, I stood there. Not triumphant. Not satisfied. Just steady. Because this wasn't about winning. It was about truth. And the truth, once exposed, doesn't ask for permission. It just exists. And in that moment, everything Edward had tried to control, his image, his story, his version of reality, was slipping out of his hands. Not because I had fought him loudly, but because I had stopped letting him define me quietly. And now everyone could see it. Not the version of me he had created, but the version of him he had tried to hide. After the room finally emptied that afternoon, the silence felt different. Not heavy, not suffocating, just honest. The movers had left first, quickly, quietly, without asking questions. Lily followed not long after, though she didn't say a word to me before she walked out. She paused briefly near the door as if she wanted to say something, then thought better of it. Edward remained the longest. Of course he did. He always stayed until he believed he had regained some form of control. But this time there was nothing left for him to control. He stood in the center of the living room, looking around like a man trying to recognize a place that had suddenly turned unfamiliar. "This isn't over," he said finally. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear him, but because for the first time I didn't feel the need to answer. After a moment, he left, and just like that, my house was quiet again. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table alone. The same table where I had served thousands of meals. The same table where my children had done their homework, where birthdays had been celebrated, where apologies had been made and sometimes avoided. And now it felt like a place where something had finally been acknowledged. Not fixed, not resolved, but seen. I called Diane. "It's done," I said. "For now," she replied. I leaned back in my chair. "He's not going to stop," I added. "No," she said. "He's not." There was no comfort in her voice, just truth. "Then what's next?" I asked. There was a pause. Then Diane said something that shifted everything again. "We go on offense." I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means we stop reacting to what he's done," she said, "and start exposing what he's been doing." The words settled slowly. Exposing. Not just defending. Not just protecting. But revealing. "I'm listening," I said. Over the next hour, Diane walked me through everything they had uncovered and everything they were beginning to understand. It wasn't just the affair. It never had been. The financial records I had gathered, the ones that didn't quite make sense, had started to form a pattern. Transfers between accounts that weren't directly connected to Edward's primary business. Small amounts at first, then larger ones, always structured in a way that avoided attention. "There's a company tied to these transactions," Diane explained. "A limited liability entity that appears to have no clear operational purpose. The one I showed you," I said. "Yes," she confirmed. "And it's not just inactive. It's being used." "For what?" There was a pause. "For movement," she said carefully. "Money being redirected. Repositioned." My stomach tightened. "Is that illegal?" "It depends on the source of the funds," she replied, "and how they're being reported. And if they're not being reported, then it becomes something much more serious." I stared at the table in front of me. Edward had always been careful, calculated, precise. But this felt different. This felt desperate. "Why would he do that?" I asked. Diane didn't answer immediately. "Because something isn't stable," she said finally. "Financially, or personally, or both." I thought about that. About the late nights. The sudden urgency in his work. The tension I had mistaken for distance. "What if he's losing money?" I asked. "That's one possibility," she said. "Another is that he's trying to hide it." From who Diane's voice remained steady. "That's what we're going to find out." A few days later, the situation took an unexpected turn. Lily called me. I almost didn't answer. But something in me, something that had learned to pay attention, told me to pick up. "Teresa," she said, her voice quieter than I had ever heard it. "Yes," I replied. There was a pause. "I need to talk to you," she said. I didn't agree immediately, not out of hesitation, but out of caution. "Why?" I asked. Another pause. "Because I think he's been lying to both of us," she said. That, at least, I already knew. But I let her continue. "Meet me," she added, "somewhere public." I chose a small cafe, not the one I had gone to with Grace, but something similar. Quiet, neutral, safe. Lily arrived 5 minutes late. She looked different. Not dramatically, but enough. The confidence she had worn in my foyer was gone. In its place was something sharper, more aware. "I didn't know," she said before even sitting down. "I believe that," I replied. She blinked, surprised. "You do." "Yes," I said, "because if you had known, you wouldn't have walked in like that." That seemed to disarm her more than anything else. She sat down slowly. "He told me you were distant," she said. "That you didn't care anymore. That the marriage was basically over." I didn't respond. Not because it didn't matter, but because it didn't change anything. "He said the house was his," she continued, "that everything was already being handled legally." I nodded slightly. "I know what he said," I replied. Lily looked down at her hands. "I thought I was stepping into something that had already ended," she said quietly. "That's how it always looks from the outside," I said. There was a long pause. Then she reached into her bag. "I found something," she said. My attention sharpened immediately. "What kind of something?" She pulled out her phone, unlocking it with slightly unsteady hands. "Messages," she said. "Emails." Things he showed me without realizing what they meant. She turned the screen toward me. I leaned forward, and as I read, the pieces that Diane had been assembling began to fall into place. Transfers, names, references to accounts I hadn't seen before, and then a message from Edward. Once everything is transferred, we won't have to worry about any claims. It'll all be clean. My chest tightened. Transferred where, I asked. Lily shook her head. I don't know, she said, but he kept saying it would be safe once it was done. Safe. That word again, but not in the way it was supposed to mean. This wasn't about safety. This was about hiding. About moving things out of reach, out of sight, out of accountability. You realize what this is, don't you? I said quietly. Lily nodded slowly. I think so, she said. We sat there in silence for a moment. Two women who had been placed on opposite sides of a story neither of us had been told fully. Until now. I'm not helping him anymore, she said finally. I looked at her. Good, I replied, because whatever Edward had started, whatever he thought he could control, was no longer contained. Not within his marriage, not within his lies, and not within the version of reality he had been building, because now the truth wasn't just something I held, it was something that was beginning to spread, and once that happens, there's no pulling it back. In a town like Savannah, reputation travels faster than truth. It moves through church pews and charity luncheons, across manicured lawns and whispered conversations that sound polite on the surface but carry weight underneath. People don't always say things directly here, but they say enough. Within a week of that afternoon in my foyer, I began to feel the shift. It started small. A woman I had known for 15 years glanced at me a little too quickly in the grocery store, then pretended she hadn't seen me. A neighbor who used to wave every morning suddenly found something very interesting on the other side of the street when I stepped outside. Then came the calls. Not from close friends, from acquaintances. People who didn't know me well enough to ask directly, but were curious enough to reach out under the pretense of concern. I heard things have been difficult lately. I just wanted to check in on you. I hope you're taking care of yourself. It didn't take long to understand what was happening. Edward had started talking. Not openly, not directly, but strategically. He's framing the narrative, Diane said when I told her. What narrative, I asked, though I already knew the answer. That you're unstable, she replied. Emotional, difficult, possibly not thinking clearly. I let out a slow breath. So he's continuing. Yes, she said. Because it's the only path he has left that gives him leverage. Leverage. That word again. Edward wasn't trying to win an argument. He was trying to control perception. Because in situations like this, perception can become power. And if enough people believed his version of events, it could create pressure, social, emotional, even legal. But this time, I wasn't alone. Let him talk, Diane said. We respond with facts. It sounded simple, but it wasn't. Because facts don't always move as quickly as rumors, and they don't always feel as convincing. Still, I trusted her, because everything she had said so far had proven true. The first real test came at church that Sunday. I almost didn't go. The thought of walking into that space, knowing people had already begun forming opinions, made something inside me tighten. But then I realized something. If I stayed home, I would be confirming his version, so I went. I walked in the same way I always had. Head up, shoulders steady. Not pretending nothing was wrong, but not apologizing for existing either. The first few moments were exactly what I expected. Glances, whispers, a few hesitant smiles. Then as I made my way down the aisle, I heard it. She's been having a hard time from what I hear. Edward's been under so much pressure. It's sad, really. I kept walking, not because it didn't affect me, but because stopping would have. After the service, I was approached by a woman named Patricia, someone I had known casually for years. Teresa, she said, softly placing a hand on my arm, I just want you to know we're all praying for you. The words were kind, but the implication underneath them wasn't. Thank you, I replied. She hesitated. Edward mentioned you've been overwhelmed lately, she added. There it was, carefully placed. Not an accusation, a suggestion. I met her eyes. I've been dealing with a lot, I said calmly, but I'm very clear on what's happening. She blinked slightly, taken aback. I'm sure you are, she said quickly. And just like that, the conversation shifted. Because confidence, real confidence, does something rumors can't easily compete with. It doesn't argue. It doesn't explain. It simply exists. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Because defending yourself quietly is harder than fighting loudly. But Diane was right. This wasn't the time for emotional reactions. It was the time for precision. A few days later, that precision began to pay off. Diane called me late in the afternoon. "I think we have something," she said. I sat down immediately. "What kind of something?" One of Edward's associates reached out, she explained. "Someone who's worked with him for years." My attention sharpened. "Why would they do that?" "Because they're concerned," she said. "And possibly protecting themselves." That made sense. If Edward was doing what we suspected, moving money, hiding transactions, he wasn't just risking his own position. He was putting others in danger too. "What did they say?" I asked. "They confirmed irregularities," Diane replied. "Transfers that don't align with client accounts. Movements that could raise serious questions if examined closely." My grip tightened on the phone. "So, it's real?" "Yes," she said. "And it's bigger than we initially thought." A quiet silence followed. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind for days. "Is this criminal?" Diane didn't rush her answer. "It could be," she said carefully, "depending on intent and scope." I leaned back, trying to process that. Edward, my husband, the man who had built his entire identity around trust and professionalism, now standing on the edge of something that could destroy everything. "Why would he risk that?" I asked. "Because he's already losing control," Diane said. "And people who are losing control often make increasingly desperate decisions to regain it." That word again, desperate. It fit. More than I wanted it to. Because everything Edward had done recently, every move, every lie, every manipulation felt less like strategy now, and more like panic disguised as confidence. "What do we do?" I asked. "We document," Diane said. "We organize. And when the time is right, we present." "Present to who?" "That depends," she replied. "But likely more than just a family court." The implication was clear. This wasn't just about divorce anymore. It wasn't even just about property. It was about exposure, on a level Edward had never anticipated. That evening, Michael came by. He didn't call first. He just showed up. I opened the door and saw something in his face I hadn't seen in a long time. Uncertainty. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Of course," I said. He stepped inside, looking around the house like he was seeing it differently now. "Mom!" he began, then stopped. I waited. "I'm sorry," he said finally. The words were simple, but they mattered. "For what?" I asked gently. "For not listening," he replied. "For assuming you were wrong." I nodded slowly. "That's okay," I said. "You believed what you were told." He shook his head. "No," he said. "I believed what was easier." That honesty surprised me and moved me more than I expected. We sat down in the living room, the same space where everything had unfolded days earlier. "What's really going on with Dad?" he asked. I considered my answer carefully, because this wasn't just about telling the truth. It was about deciding how much of it to share. "He's been making decisions that aren't what they seem," I said. Michael frowned. "That's not very specific." "No," I agreed. "It's not." He looked at me. "Is he in trouble?" he asked. I met his gaze. "Yes," I said. He swallowed. "What kind of trouble?" I didn't answer that. "Not yet. Because some truths take time, and some need to be revealed in the right moment." But one thing was already clear. Edward's version of reality, the one he had built so carefully, so quietly, was beginning to collapse. Not all at once, but piece by piece, and this time, there was no way to stop it. The week that followed felt like standing at the edge of a storm you can finally see but can't yet predict. Everything was in motion, quietly, precisely, inevitably. Diane had begun preparing what she called a controlled presentation. Not an emotional confrontation, not a dramatic reveal, but a structured, undeniable exposure of facts layered in a way that left no room for interpretation. "This is where people make mistakes," she told me during one of our meetings. "They rush. They want the truth out immediately. But timing matters." "And this is the right time?" I asked. "Almost," she said. That word stayed with me. Almost. Because what we were building toward wasn't just about proving Edward wrong. It was about making sure he couldn't twist the truth once it was revealed. 2 days later, Diane called me early in the morning. "It's happening," she said. My chest tightened slightly. "What is he's filed?" she replied. "Filed what? A petition," she said, "claiming concern over your capacity to manage your affairs." The words landed exactly the way I expected. Not surprising, but still heavy. "So he's moving forward with it," I said. "Yes," Diane confirmed, "and he's doing it sooner than I expected." "Why?" "Because he's feeling pressure," she said. "And pressure leads to urgency. Urgency leads to mistakes." I stood in the kitchen, staring out at the yard that had once felt like the safest place in the world. "And we're ready?" I asked. Diane didn't hesitate. "Yes." The hearing wasn't a dramatic courtroom spectacle. Not yet. It was smaller, controlled, procedural, but the stakes were just as real. Edward was already there when I arrived. Of course he was. He stood near the front, speaking quietly with his attorney, his posture composed, his expression carefully neutral. To anyone who didn't know him, he looked calm, professional, in control, but I knew better. I could see it in the way his fingers tapped lightly against his arm, in the slight tension in his jaw, in the way his eyes flicked toward me just a second too quickly before looking away. He was holding it together, but barely. Emily was there. So was Michael. Neither of them stood next to Edward. That alone said more than anything else. When Diane and I took our seats, she placed a folder in front of me. "Everything we need is in here," she said quietly. I nodded. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because I was ready. The proceedings began simply. Edward's attorney spoke first. Measured, polished, carefully worded. He outlined concerns about my recent behavior, my emotional instability, and my declining ability to manage complex financial and personal responsibilities. Each phrase was chosen deliberately, each one designed to sound reasonable, concerned, protective. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed him. Then it was Diane's turn. She didn't stand immediately. She didn't interrupt. She waited until the last word had settled into the room. Then she rose. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady, "what has just been presented is not a reflection of my client's condition." She paused. "It is a reflection of a narrative that has been strategically constructed." The shift was immediate. Not loud, but unmistakable. Diane didn't argue emotionally. She dismantled, piece by piece. First, she presented the independent medical evaluation. Clear, recent, unquestionable. A full assessment confirming my cognitive health, my decision-making capacity, and my ability to manage my affairs. Edward's attorney tried to respond, but there was very little to say against documented evidence. Then Diane moved to the next layer. "The court should also consider the context in which these claims are being made," she said. That was when everything began to change. Because context changes everything. She introduced the property records, the trust documentation, the legal structure that made it undeniably clear that the house, my house, was not and had never been Edward's. I saw it happen in real time, the shift in attention, the quiet recalibration of understanding. This wasn't a concerned husband trying to protect his wife. This was a man attempting to assert control over something he did not own. And then Diane took it further. Additionally, she said, "We have reason to believe that the timing of this petition is not coincidental." Edward's attorney objected. But Diane was ready. She didn't accuse. She presented. Financial records, patterns, transactions. Nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional. Just facts, carefully placed, one after another. I didn't look at Edward at first. I didn't need to. I could feel the shift in him, the tension tightening, the control slipping. Then finally I did. And what I saw was not the man I had been married to for 36 years. It was someone else, someone exposed. Because for the first time, Edward wasn't speaking. He wasn't guiding the narrative. He wasn't shaping perception. He was reacting, and reacting poorly. When his attorney attempted to redirect, to reframe, to soften, Edward interrupted. "None of that is relevant," he said, his voice sharper than it had been before. Diane didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because that moment, that loss of composure, said more than any argument could. The judge noticed. Everyone did. "Mr. Cook," the judge said calmly, "you will allow your counsel to speak." Edward nodded, but the damage was already done. Because composure isn't just about how you present yourself, it's about how long you can maintain it under pressure. And Edward's was beginning to crack. By the time Diane finished, the room felt different, not tense, not uncertain, just clear. Because what had started as a question of my capacity had become something else entirely, a question of his intent. And intent is much harder to defend. When the session ended, there was no dramatic declaration, no final verdict, just a quiet understanding that things had shifted. Significantly. Outside in the hallway, Emily approached me slowly. "Mom," she said. I turned toward her. "I didn't know," she added, her voice unsteady. "I know," I replied. She looked down. "I should have," she said. I didn't correct her, because guilt wasn't what she needed. Truth was, Michael joined us a moment later. "He's in trouble," he said quietly. I met his eyes. "Yes," I said, not as a warning, not as a threat, just as a fact. Behind us, Edward exited the room. He didn't look at me. Not this time, because for the first time, he didn't have control over what I represented, and without that control, he had nothing left to stand on. After the hearing, something inside me went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that feels empty. The kind that comes after a storm has passed, when the air is still, the damage is visible, and you're left standing in the middle of what remains. Edward didn't call. Not that day. Not the next. For 36 years, silence from him would have unsettled me. I would have replayed every conversation, questioned every word, wondered what I had done wrong. But now his silence felt like confirmation, not of his strength, but of his unraveling. 3 days later, Diane called. "They've withdrawn the petition," she said. I closed my eyes briefly, letting that settle. "So that's it?" I asked. "For that part," she replied. "Yes." I nodded slowly. "And the rest?" There was a pause. "The rest is still moving," she said, "and it's not looking good for him." That was the thing about consequences. They don't always arrive all at once. Sometimes they come in layers. Quiet at first, then undeniable. Over the next 2 weeks, the pieces began to fall faster. Edward's associate, the one who had initially reached out, wasn't the only one. Once questions started being asked, others followed. Accounts were reviewed, transactions examined, and the patterns Diane had identified became harder and harder to ignore. I didn't need every detail. I didn't need every number. I just needed to understand one thing. Edward's world, the one he had built so carefully, was no longer stable. And he knew it. The first time I saw him again after the hearing, it wasn't planned. I had gone to pick up a few documents from his office, something Diane had arranged through his legal team. He was there, standing behind his desk, looking smaller, not physically, but in presence. The confidence he carried so naturally for years wasn't gone, but it wasn't steady anymore. "Teresa," he said when I stepped inside. I didn't respond immediately. I took in the room. The same office I had helped him build from nothing. The same desk I had dusted, organized, supported from the background while he became the man everyone admired. And now, it felt like a stage after the performance had ended. "What are you doing here?" he asked. "Collecting documents," I said. He nodded slowly. Of course, everything was official now, structured, no longer something he could control through tone or presence. "I didn't think it would go this way," he said after a moment. I looked at him. "No," I replied. "You didn't." He exhaled, running a hand over his face. "You could have talked to me," he said. "We didn't have to end up here." That almost made me smile. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. "We did talk," I said. "For years." He shook his head. "That's not what I mean." "I know," I replied, because what he meant was something else. He meant I could have stayed quiet, compliant, manageable. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice tightening slightly. "Everything we built it," I corrected. The words landed harder than I expected, because for the first time I wasn't letting him take that away from me. Not the work, not the years, not the life we had created. Edward didn't argue. He didn't correct me. He just looked tired. "You don't understand what I was dealing with," he said. I held his gaze. "Then explain it," I said. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I realized something. He couldn't. Not in a way that would justify what he had done, not in a way that would make sense. Things got complicated, he said finally. There it was again. Complicated, a word that hides more than it reveals. They didn't have to, I replied. He looked away, because he knew that was true. There was a long silence between us, not hostile, not emotional, just final. I never meant for it to go this far, he said quietly. I believed him, not because he didn't intend harm, but because he didn't expect consequences. And those are not the same thing. That doesn't change where we are, I said. He nodded slowly. No, he said. It doesn't. I collected the documents I had come for, turned toward the door, and for a moment I paused. Not because I wanted to stay, but because I realized something important. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I had been. The anger had done its job. It had moved me, protected me, forced me to act. But now, it had nothing left to hold on to. What remained was something else. Clarity. I hope you figure things out, I said. He looked up at me surprised. You mean that? He asked. Yes, I said. Because I did. Not for him, but for me. Because holding on to bitterness would keep me tied to a version of him I no longer needed. I left without looking back. That evening, the house felt different again. Not empty, not heavy, just mine. Michael came by later that night. He didn't say much at first, just sat across from me looking like he was still trying to process everything. He's losing everything, isn't he said finally. I considered that. Some things, I replied. Michael nodded slowly. I don't know how to feel about that, he admitted. You don't have to decide right now, I said. He looked at me. I thought I knew him, he said. So did I replied. We sat in silence for a while. Not uncomfortable, just honest. I should have listened to you, he said after a moment. I shook my head. You're listening now, I said. And that mattered more. Upstairs, the house creaked softly, the familiar sounds of a place that had held a lifetime of memories. But those memories felt different now. Not erased, not forgotten, just redefined. Because the truth doesn't destroy everything. It reveals what was real and what wasn't. And in the quiet that followed everything that had happened, I finally understood the difference. The first thing I did was repaint the kitchen. It might sound small, insignificant even, but after everything that had happened, I realized something very simple. If I was going to stay in this house, I couldn't keep living in it the same way. Not physically, not emotionally, not at all. The kitchen had always been the heart of our home. Warm tones, dark cabinets, soft yellow lighting, everything designed to feel inviting, comforting, familiar. But now every corner of it carried something else. Echoes. Memories of conversations where I had swallowed my thoughts. Moments where I had adjusted myself to make someone else more comfortable. Years of quiet compromises layered so deeply into the space that I could feel them even when I stood still. So I changed it. White cabinets, lighter walls, new lighting. Not because I wanted something trendy, but because I needed something honest. Something that didn't carry the weight of who I used to be. As the painters worked, I stood in the doorway one afternoon watching the transformation unfold, and for the first time in a long time I felt something shift. Not loss, not grief, but space. The kind of space that lets you breathe again. Michael noticed it first. He came by one evening, stepping into the kitchen and pausing. Wow, he said quietly, looking around. This feels different. It is, I replied. He nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. It really is. There was something in his tone, something thoughtful, almost careful that hadn't been there before. He was seeing things now. Not just the house, but me. Over the next few weeks, he started showing up more often. Not out of obligation, but intention. He fixed things that didn't need fixing. Organized paperwork I had already sorted, brought groceries I hadn't asked for. At first, I thought he was trying to make up for something. But then I realized he wasn't trying to fix the past. He was trying to understand the present. I didn't see it, he said one afternoon as we sat in the living room going through some documents together. I know, I replied. He shook his head. No, he said. I really didn't see it. The way he talked to you. The way you... He hesitated. What I asked gently. The way you disappeared, he said. The words landed softly, but they stayed. Because he was right. I had. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but slowly, quietly, piece by piece, until there was barely anything left for anyone to notice, except now. Now there was. Emily's journey was different, harder, not because she didn't care, but because she had built something inside herself that took longer to unravel. She came by one afternoon without calling. I found her standing in the garden near the old magnolia tree, the same place she used to sit as a teenager when she needed space. "Hi," she said when she saw me. "Hi," I replied. We stood there for a moment, the silence between us, not uncomfortable but not easy either. "I started seeing someone," she said suddenly. I blinked. "A therapist," she added quickly. I nodded. "That's good," I said. She looked down at her hands. "I think I learned something from him," she said. "From Dad?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. "I learned how to ignore things that made me uncomfortable," she continued. "How to tell myself everything was fine even when it wasn't." Her voice wavered slightly. "And when you tried to say something, I shut you down." I stepped closer. "You were trying to keep things stable," I said. She shook her head. "I was trying to keep things easy," she replied. "That honesty, it mattered. More than an apology ever could." "I don't want to do that anymore," she said. I nodded. "Then don't," I replied. "Because healing isn't about rewriting the past. It's about changing what you do with it." We started small. Lunches, conversations. Not about everything. Not all at once. But enough. Enough to begin building something new. Something real. The house continued to change. Not all at once. Not dramatically, but intentionally. I donated furniture I had kept out of habit, not attachment. Rearranged rooms that had been organized around someone else's preferences. Opened windows I used to keep closed. Let light in where I hadn't realized it was missing. And slowly, the house stopped feeling like a place where something had ended, and started feeling like a place where something was beginning. Grace visited one afternoon, standing in the living room with a quiet smile. "You did it," she said. "I'm still doing it," I replied. She nodded. "That's the point," she said. We sat together talking the way we used to, easily, honestly, without the need to filter or soften. "You know," she added after a moment, "a lot of people would have just sold the house." I smiled slightly. "I thought about it," I admitted. "But you didn't." "No," I said. "Why?" I looked around. At the walls, the light, the space that now felt like mine in a way it hadn't before. "Because leaving wouldn't have been freedom," I said. "It would have been escape." Grace nodded slowly. "And staying?" she asked. "Staying," I said, "is choice." That was the difference. Not being forced, not being pushed, but choosing. For the first time in a long time, one evening as the sun set through the kitchen windows, I stood at the counter preparing dinner. Not for a crowd, not for an event, just for myself. Michael and Emily were coming later, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And that felt different. Real. As I set the table, I paused for a moment, my hand resting lightly against the surface. This house had held everything. Love, tension, silence, betrayal. And now, something else. Not perfection. Not resolution. But truth. And truth, I had learned, doesn't always feel comfortable. But it feels right. Because it doesn't require you to shrink, or adjust, or disappear. It allows you to stand exactly where you are. And finally, be seen. Sometimes I think back to that moment in the foyer, not because I'm stuck there, but because I understand it differently now. At the time, it felt like everything was collapsing. A stranger in my home, my husband's absence speaking louder than his presence ever had. My life packed into boxes by people who didn't know me, didn't ask, didn't care. And then I laughed. For a long time, I wondered why. Why that reaction? Why not anger? Why not tears? Why not the kind of breakdown that would have made sense to everyone watching? But now, standing in the quiet of my kitchen months later, I understand. That laugh wasn't hysteria. It wasn't denial. It was recognition. A moment when something inside me finally saw the truth so clearly that it could no longer be distorted. Because in that instant, I understood something I hadn't fully allowed myself to accept before. They thought I was powerless. Edward thought that years of silence meant weakness, that patience meant passivity, That loyalty meant dependence. And Lily, she believed the version of me he had created. A woman who would step aside quietly, who would accept being replaced, who would leave without asking questions. But they were both wrong. Not because I had suddenly changed, but because I had finally stopped pretending. Stopped pretending that peace was more important than truth. Stopped pretending that keeping a family together meant losing myself in the process. Stopped pretending that love required me to disappear. That laugh, it was the sound of all of that breaking. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. The house feels different now, not just because of the changes I made, the paint, the light, the way the rooms are arranged, but because of what it no longer carries. There's no tension waiting in the corners, no unspoken rules shaping how I move through the space, no need to anticipate someone else's mood before I speak. It's quiet, but not empty. Peaceful, but not fragile. Strong, in a way I never understood before. Michael and Emily come over regularly now, not as visitors, not as guests navigating something uncomfortable, but as part of something that feels honest. We don't pretend everything is perfect. We don't avoid what happened, but we don't live inside it either. We talk, we listen, we disagree sometimes, and we move forward. That's what healing looks like. Not forgetting, not erasing, but choosing not to let the past define the shape of the future. Edward and I don't speak. Not directly. There are lawyers, documents, processes that still need to be completed. But the emotional part of it, that's already over. I don't hate him. And that surprised me more than anything, because I thought that would be the hardest part, letting go of the anger. But it wasn't. The hardest part was letting go of who I thought he was. The version of him I had protected, defended, believed in. Once that was gone, there was nothing left to hold on to. And without that weight, something else became possible. Freedom. Not the kind that comes from running away, but the kind that comes from standing still and realizing you no longer have to carry what isn't yours. One evening, not long ago, I stood in the foyer again. The same place where everything had changed. The light was softer this time, the air still, no voices, no tension, just space. I walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out onto the porch. The magnolia tree stood exactly where it always had, unmoved, unchanged, and yet everything around it felt different. Because I was different. I thought about the woman who had stood in that doorway months ago, the one who had been told to leave her own home. And I realized something. She could have. She could have walked away, avoided the conflict, protected the illusion, kept the peace at the cost of everything else. And no one would have been surprised. That's what they expected. That's what I had always done. But she didn't. I didn't. And that choice, that single moment of refusing to step aside, changed everything. Not just legally, not just financially, but emotionally, completely. Because once you choose yourself, truly choose yourself, it becomes very difficult to go back to being someone who doesn't. I went back inside, closing the door behind me, not as someone being shut out, but as someone who belonged, fully, completely, without question. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. There's a quiet kind of strength that many women carry for years, especially those of us who were taught that keeping the peace was more important than being heard. We learn to adjust, to soften our voices, to ignore the small things that don't feel right because addressing them might create conflict. And over time, those small things become patterns. Those patterns become reality. And that reality slowly erases parts of who we are. What I learned, what I wish I had understood sooner is this. Silence does not protect you. It protects the person who benefits from it. Love does not require you to disappear. And loyalty should never cost you your dignity. Standing up for yourself doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like quiet preparation, clear thinking, and choosing the right moment to say, no more. Even if it takes years, even if it changes everything. Because here's the truth no one tells you. It's never too late to reclaim your life. Not at 30, not at 50, not at 62, and not after everything feels like it's already been decided for you. You are allowed to change the ending. You are allowed to choose yourself. And when you do, you might lose the version of life you thought you had, but you gain something far more important: the truth. If this story spoke to you in any way, I'd love to hear from you. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Have you ever had a moment where you finally chose yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in stories about strength, truth, and starting over, don't forget to like and subscribe. You're not alone, and you never have been.